A fascinating commission has come my way. A portrait of one Peter Hutton, headmaster, president no less, of Ratcliffe College in Leicestershire from around 1850 until his death in 1880, aged 69. This is the only known image of him, a photograph of a lost painting. It's not much to go on. I want to bring him to life. Paintings in the 18th and 19th centuries seem almost alive with form and texture. Even if their sitters were stern or of a rigid demeanour, they appear to advance from the canvas towards us. This old master approach seems the appropriate manner to depict my absent sitter and to give his portrait its proper place in the college. I'll begin with a composition sketch.
Initially, I make a gesture drawing. Accurate shapes and their relationship to the centre and the edges of the canvas are the key. When you're making a portrait, it's the relationship between the type of shape and the angle of the shape that really gives us lightness. I'm thinking about the tones of these shapes in a much more simplified way. Light against dark, dark against light. Dark shapes, psychologically, carry more weight than light shapes. Our eyes follow the flow of light in a painting, so planning the light and shadow flow at this stage is a good idea. A composition sketch is the beginning of the problem-solving process for artists. You can see in this angle how the finished painting develops and grows out of the composition sketch. I start this portrait on a bistro ground with another gesture drawing.
So this is the gesture drawing. We've got a gesture of a head in. It notes basically the proportion, attitude and the curve of the lines that give you the idea of his head. I'm not worried about where the contours of tone begin and end, but there is one thing that's noteworthy. In most paintings, it's particularly important in portraits, to find a rhythm, a unit that repeats and repeats within the composition, and we've got one here. Distance between top of his head and the top of the canvas, from his head to his eyebrow, corner of his mouth, just below his collar here. Same distance from one edge to the edge of the eye, from that edge of the eye to the back of his head where the hair finishes. This rhythm will occur everywhere in the portrait, and the more we put emphasis on the beginning and end of this proportion, this rhythm, the more pleasant the thing will be to look at it. It will appeal to the eye even more by emphasising the same rhythm over and over again. Human brains like to look for these things.
Once you start looking for it, you find this repetition of interval, unit or pattern, not only in portraiture, but everywhere in art, in every culture the world over.
So it's time to get some paint on this picture now. But before I do, I want to just have a small rethink about one of the proportions in the composition. In my sketch, I've brought the sitter's arms out so that one transits out of the picture in the bottom left-hand corner and one leaves a sliver to the right. I've done this for purposes of balance, but actually I think there might be a better solution for the portrait. So before I get any paint on, I'm just going to throw a few extra lines and have a think about whether we could balance the portrait better by reversing this compositional situation. The height of the head below here will give us an area that we need to balance light against dark. His chest needs to come outwards this way. Have a think about how those lines describe the form. If I drop this shoulder away, and raise this a little, I can begin a sleeve, the top of a sleeve here. And make a graceful sweep with a robe this way. And I can think about breaking these shapes with an interesting contour here. Concave, convex, concave, convex, concave. Similarly under the collar here, straight, little concave, little convex, convex. Convex shapes place energy into your subject matter. Concave shapes tend to suggest that forces are being pushed upon them, and a convex shape will give you the sense that the thing contains energy itself. And this goes for all sorts of shapes. So if you're painting something living or even a still life, often choosing to manipulate your shapes with convex edges, hard and soft convex edges, will give you that sense of liveliness. Now, see, what I've done is to pin the sitter's arm on this side of the canvas to this corner, rather than leaving a sliver here. And now, with the shoulders in perspective, I have a smaller distance here, which is in keeping with the direction of his gaze, and I've got the ability to bring this one down, if I wish, within the edge, so that we've got a complete edge there. This actually gives a sense of the eye being able to look beyond the sitter. So it'll make the background recede away more, and it gives us a sense of escape. If I bring his body all the way, if I did this, and brought his body all the way to the edge here, because he would fill the whole canvas at the bottom, it would seem as if he was smotheringly close to us. So leaving that little gap enables us to feel that there's a means of the escape of our gaze as we look towards him. Might be worth mentioning here before I get any paint on that we're thinking about perspective with the sitter. In particular, I want to make sure that his eye line is just a little above ours. This gives the sitter a sense of being above us, being in authority, really. And we don't want to make him appear aloof, but we do want him to be an authority figure, because that's what he was. So that's one of the ways in which we'll describe him. So if our eye level is about here, then his brow level will be up a little like this, and the level of his cheeks will be a little less, and the chin a little less, so until we finally here meet our eye level roughly with his neck. And I think that that'll just give him that sense of being above us slightly. Okay, from this stage we're going to go on, get some black and white paint on and produce the grisaille. So that's the next step. Okay, the grisaille will be painted with black and white paint. I've got set out here a couple of different whites. We've got a student quality white, this one's Pebeo, this one's a good professional quality Michael Harding one. And I've got two different kinds of black here. This one's actually a very, very dark brown, it's called neutral tint, it's quite a solid colour. And then this one is an ivory black. They're no longer made with ivory, but they are an extremely well balanced, neutral, jet black, a really dark colour. So I'll be using these four, but before I get started I'm going to need a bit of medium in the paint. So let's make some. This is a nice easy medium to use. It won't leave a lot of brush marks behind. it's a good idea to use this one as a beginner, but we will be using lots of other mediums in this painting, and I'll show you how they work as we go along. So let's make a start by mixing some strings. So a string is just a gradation of colour between two piles of paint. I pull a bit of this white away from the pile here. It's a titanium white. And we'll pull a bit of this neutral tint, this very dark brown, away from that pile. Down the middle we go. There we go. Gradation. This means if I mix up plenty of paint between the darkest tone and the lightest tone, it means I've always got a tone to choose from, rather than mixing a pool of this and a pool of that and then adding to it to get the right tone. We've always got a range to choose from. This speeds up the work incredibly. So pre-mix yourself a string. Strings get more complicated when we work with colour, but right now all we're considering is how light, how dark. Let's get some paint on there.
I build the grisaille by observing tone, but there's more to it than tonal accuracy. This is a layout which prepares the way for colour added above. It's important to create good accurate shapes with tones, but they're also shapes that will look right when the colour is added. If it's too dark, the colour will appear cold when added. If it's too light, the colour may appear too warm and dark. In the half-tone shadows, some of the grisaille will remain visible in the finished work.
I've got a little selection of brushes here, and I'm going to start with one which is an oval brush. It's a hog, and if I only had one brush to use for oil paint, it would be one like this. This one is quite well worn when they're new. They look a lot more like this. Oh yeah, so that's what a new one looks like. But after a while they go in that kind of oval shape. The good thing about a brush like this is it hasn't got too sharp a tip on it. It holds a lot of paint and you can really give it some welly. So with oil paint, let's get a bit of mixture on the go here. Alright, so I've got a mid-tone grey. Right, that's got no medium in it. So, with an oval hog brush like this, you can make a sharp-edged line. You can make a blurry, soft edge. You can take one lot of paint into another. Let's change the colour, show you. You can make a soft transition between two, and you can control your edge contrast, and that's the really important bit, is that you can have a hard or a soft effect. You can impart quite a lot of paint. If you have some medium in it, it'll go a pretty long way on one stroke. Now you can see there the brokenness that happens. Now sometimes that's useful and sometimes it isn't. But I would generally use this early on in a composition to establish big shapes where I'm not too worried in most of the places about an edge contrast, but if I want a hard edge, I can still have one. It's morning and I'm ready to put another layer of paint and make progress with this painting. There's something absolutely crucial to notice about it at the moment. And that is the real difference, the qualitative difference between the surface of the paint here and the surface of the paint here. It might seem obvious to say it, but the sitter is beginning to advance towards us out of the painting and the background's beginning to recede. This is happening because the paint here is transparent or semi-transparent. The light bounces all the way through, it bounces off the gesso at the back that's primed the canvas and comes back towards us. Whereas in this part of the painting, the light hits the surface of the opaque paint and bounces straight back to us. The impression of depth is gained by the transparency here and the opacity here. Look at this section of the painting where the paint's still rather transparent. It looks as if we've got a disembodied head coming towards us out of the painting, and a body that is disappearing, that we can see through, almost kind of ghostly looking. The way to get form, therefore, is to use opaque, light paint. That will make it advance out of the canvas towards us. To show you how that works even more, I'm going to create this section not just with dark paint and leaving lighter parts for where the lighter tone is, but I'm actually going to add opaque white paint to the dark paint, and you'll see how the form is acquired out of the picture here. You've only to look back at pictures from the age when this gentleman was the head of the school to discover the way in which that process works. When you look at the finished painting, the sitter does appear to come straight out of the picture at you, and this is how it's done. Opaque paint advancing, transparent paint receding. Take a look at some examples.
If you've ever wondered how artists achieve these dramatic advance and recede effects, the grisaille is the answer. Some combine very dark context with dramatic light and textural detail. In others, it's cool against warm. Compare these works with more solidly painted pieces, where you can see the tension between perceived depth and the unity of the picture surface.
It's time for the first lot of colour to go in, and this may seem a very simple part of the procedure, but with this type of painting we build up the colours in lots and lots of layers. So this first layer is going to lay in against the context, against the background, and you'll see the difference between how transparent and opaque paint work in this instance. I'm going to give you a quick demonstration on this board. So I've got a soft brush and some medium and some burnt sienna. So I've diluted the burnt sienna, and you can see on my example board that as it goes over a semi-transparent part, we get a lot of recession in there. As it goes on to an opaque patch of paint, the appearance is very, very different between those two sections that it's over painting. Watch what happens when I get it on a very dark section. There's barely any change at all in the dark colour that's had the transparent colour put on top. So let's work this colour up into the background. Give it a quick rub off there. We'll need plenty of it. So this is a bit like breathing colour onto the canvas. Not everything is achieved in the one single layer. It takes many, many layers to achieve the full effect. The robes that he's wearing. I'm placing the colour just a little more strongly over this side. This is the lit side. So we're going to have a darker context behind the subject on the lit side. Very, very soft as we come over the shoulder here. And this will dry very quickly, this medium that I've got in it. Has dryers in it, it's got cobalt dryers in it. You can see that as I place the strokes on, you can see a brush mark, but as I go over it, because it's such a soft brush, it blends in straight away. There we go. The red colours, hot colours, tend to advance, so there's a little bit of a fight going on between the advancement of that lovely red-brown, the sienna, and the very cool form that's been generated using just the black and white paint. Let's just get a little bit, very small amount on here. And the context affects the foreground as well. Now I'm going to hesitate in adding any burnt sienna to his skin tones because we've got to deal with those separately. Just a note at this point about historical colours, historical pigments. So we have a very, very big array of pigments that we can use now, but they weren't all available in the late 1800s. It was quite an exciting time to be a painter because there were new ultramarines and chromiums and things coming along that they'd never had before. And the Impressionists, of course, made very good use of these colours. But I'm going to begin the painting in colours that would have been available really in the early 1800s, because these are the colours on which painters relied, and the new colours were often extremely expensive and would be used in very small quantities, perhaps much later in the composition. So let's have a look at what was available. They had lead white. Mine, for health reasons, is not lead, it's titanium. Titanium white, a lot more inert than lead white. They actually put titanium dioxide in your toothpaste. Now then, so we have a Naples yellow. Traditionally this was also a lead colour, what was it called? Lead antimonate, I think it was called. So we have a Naples yellow, very useful colour, Naples yellow. Doesn't easily go to green in the presence of blue, and that's ever so handy. I've got a raw sienna here. I've got yellow ochre. Quite similar, yellow ochre ever so slightly more green, neutral to green in it, tinge with it. Vermilion. This is one of the more prismatic and more bright colours that was available at the time. We have a Van Dyke brown. As you can imagine, it's very dark. And finally we have cobalt. It's not a strong blue, but it's the blue that they had. Oh, there we go. I have a feeling that might slide down the palette with it vertical there, but we'll see if it runs off. Okay. I just want to talk about the relative properties of these colours, because most of them are very, very opaque. If I get this Naples yellow on here, it is a delightful yellow. It's especially good for portraiture, but it is very opaque, and if we look at it on a dartboard, it covers that completely. Absolute opacity. So you can see that the colour is very, very similar, although it's changed by the context of being against dark or against light. The actual colour produced over dark and over light is very, very similar. So it's a reliable, solid colour. Right. Scrape that one off. We'll have a look at the sienna and the ochre. So nearly as solid, but not quite. We get a kind of glow if it's on there fairly thinly. And over the darker colour, almost a greenish hue, so warmer, cooler. Same kind of thing for the yellow ochre. A little bit more gritty in its texture, that one. Again, painted thinly, looks quite greenish over a dark colour. That's significant because we're going to be painting over both dark and light from our grisaille. The sienna, this is relatively transparent actually. We've just put a transparent coat of it on. Can you see how at the edge of it, it's that very hot coppery colour. Moves towards the red significantly here. It's quite a profound effect on the darker colour, but it's able to blend away into the shadow. Very useful colour, burnt sienna. Okay, the red, the Chinese vermilion. And you can see how much more saturate that red is than any of these earth colours. That's very significant, especially for later on when we've got to make decisions about not only the tone, but the temperature and the saturation of the colours that we're mixing. Here's that blue, it hasn't completely run down. Again, cobalt blue. It's a lovely primary blue. I forgot to put the red on there. It's relatively opaque, but you can use it as a transparent. Thin down sufficiently, any paint becomes quite transparent. I think it with a little bit of medium there, I can blend it away into the darkness nicely. Now, significantly with this blue, it's dark enough not to pull the dark tone up too far. It does, because it's an intense colour, it's saturate, there seems to be a brightness there against that dark, but if you squint, it's a fairly similar tone, so it's quite dark in tone. And the initial tonal value of the paint in mass like that, when you squeeze a mass of it out, is quite significant, because if you want it to get any darker than that, you've got to put a dark tone in with it. So colours which begin dark, like this Van Dyke brown, have that flexibility. Looks almost black, doesn't it? I think that probably is what this board is primed with. It is. So this board has got some Van Dyke brown on it, but look at the difference between the dry paint, which is put on quite thinly, and the wet paint. So as it's dried, it's gone up a little bit in tone, and it's gone more flat looking, almost a bloom like you'd get on a grape. And that's because as the linseed oil dries, it changes its opacity ever so slightly. And that's one of the reasons why we add medium to the paint. And just put a bit of medium in, and hopefully you'll see what I mean. So here's that glazing medium I was using earlier. I'll pick up a tiny bit of that earth brown again, the Van Dyke brown. Do you see how that's even darker? So the appearance of the paint has been changed by the addition of the medium. So we put mediums in partly to change how the paint appears, partly to change how the paint behaves, make it thinner, thicker, more flowing, more so it sticks to the pits and surfaces of the canvas. Okay, let's have a look at a few of these colours behaving with one another. So here's that Naples yellow. And what's really significant here is how it behaves with colours that one would use in skin tone mixes. Just put a bit of it away from the pile here. So if we want an orange, can you see how that's gone kind of pink with the vermilion? If we want an orange, we've got to go for this deeper yellow in order to achieve it. We can also use this yellow with the burnt sienna for a series of cooler oranges, and I just get that brush uncontaminated by the ochre. If we take this Naples yellow again, we're going to take it over here. Now let's watch what it does when we get the cobalt in it. It goes to blue. It goes vaguely through green, but not an intense green at all. Let's just wash the cobalt out the brush and see what the Naples yellow does with some ivory black in it, because that's the other pigment that we're going to maintain use of. Now you get a bluish grey. It's a very cold bluish grey with the Naples yellow there. And we noticed with the grisaille that we painted that the black and white almost made a bluish grey. We can make other greys with our Castle Earth. There's the Rembrandt brown. It's very warm when you put it in either in mass or in dilution. Just thin that with some, there we are. Do you see how warm that brown is? Now instead of putting it thinly over the white, I'm going to mix it with white. Brown, white. By the time I get it to a similar tone, to that which was put very thinly over the white background, leaving the white showing through, the tone of that is so much, it's a similar tone, but the temperature of that is so much warmer here than here. It is the same colour, but this is laid thinly over white and this is mixed with white. And it's very important to know what your paint characteristics are when you mix them with white, because most of them get much, much colder. Reds are the ones we notice the most, but all colours do it to an extent. Pull a bit of this white down the edge. So we've seen what it does with the brown. We can have a very cold blue. We'll get a red that tends to the purple, so the temperature gets much colder. Vermilion is better than a lot of reds for that. A lot of reds will go really almost to the magenta pink when you start putting white in them. Vermilion doesn't do it as much as a lot of the other colours. It's why it's so useful in portraiture. Here's our sienna. It's gone from being that hot orange and hot red brown to quite a cold brown. The Naples yellow won't be quite so affected. It is a slightly cooler yellow, but not desperately. And finally, the two earth colours, the ochre and the sienna. And both of those form quite a pleasant, they're quite a hot yellow anyway, they form quite a pleasant yellow, which is fairly neutral when you get white in them. So it's worth having a play around when you've got your initial set of paints laid out on your palette, whether you're going primary or secondaries, opposing them on the colour wheel, or whether you're simply going with earth tones and a couple of bright tones to make a start. It's worth having a look at what they do to each other. Do they get warmer and cooler in one another's presence, and which ones are transparent? And when you mix a transparent and opaque, the transparent colour will be affected more than the opaque colour. So things like that I have to bear in mind. Now you can begin to see some skin tones coming up here, and due to the way that we're going to work, it's an advantage to have them ever so slightly transparent. We're going to put them on very, very thinly in several layers.
The colour layer attends first to middle tones and temperatures, moving to lower middle and upper middle tones. This is my habit, and it's not the only way to work. I attend to large areas first, breaking them into ever smaller detail, and standing back often, or even looking at the work in a mirror or as a thumbnail on my phone to check firstly the shapes, then the tones and form, the flow, and finally the likeness.
Quick bit of colour mixing logic, first thing this morning. Right, we're going to look at mixing a low, middle and a couple of high tones for flesh. Let's start with the lower tone colours. If you're painting direct, you can mix a solid tone. And start with some neutral browns, pull in a little red and some Naples yellow. Now, you'll notice straight away that where you've got a very high tone paint, you can only get down a certain degree in terms of tonality, and you also tend to get quite a muddy looking mixture of paint. So one way to tackle the lower tones is to use more transparent colours. So we've got this one here, let me pull it away from the pile. This is a transparent red oxide. We can mix that with the cobalt. It gives us quite a green tone. if I bring a little bit of vermilion into that, I can get a warm low tone, or I can have it greener still with a little bit of viridian. So that red oxide and the viridian make really quite a dark tone altogether. Let's just see what that looks like. Very, very deep shadow. Now it's a good idea to establish your shadows with a neutral to cool tone. Even a little bit of green can go directly into them. Green in the shadows emphasises the red in the higher tones. Now, having placed some of that shadow in, I now want to augment it. It looks a bit cold and it looks a bit dark brown. The shadow, if it's too cool, we can heat it up with a little bit of red. And I'm going to use that red, so I've gone halfway in between a really dark shadow colour and a little bit of extra red. This is red ochre, and within the shadows you can place these warmer tones and they make the shadows lively. So that's some of the darker tones in a picture. Let's have a look at middle tones. Now flesh is deceptively neutral. So what we're going to do is I'm going to bring in a range of yellow ochre. There's a little bit of sienna. Let's pull some of that cobalt across. A little bit of green. Can you see that what I'm doing is creating cool and warm middle tones? That's a fairly neutral grey middle tone. Let's augment that with a little bit of yellow. What I'm aiming for is to create a range of low and higher saturation colours and cool and warm colours, so that I've got somewhere to go, something to pick from. So let's pick from across the neutral first. Now as colours go from a shadow into the light, giving him some fairly dramatic light here, they can often go through quite a strong colour change. So I quite often use a more vibrant red or yellow just at the point where the shadow meets the light. This is more saturate. Let's put that up again. So I'm going for the middle tone with a more saturate red here. You can go for a more saturate orange as well. If I pull some vermilion in with that ochre, we get an orange. So sometimes we don't want the flesh to look quite so vascular, and we go for a yellow or orange transition rather than a red one. So orange transition there. Now let's have a look at some of the higher tones. So we're middle high, not the very highest highlights, but middle high. So now we're going to look at warmer tones altogether, and this is because of the nature of light. If we have yellow light or orange light on the warm side of the spectrum, this will tend to increase the saturation, especially of red and yellow tones. Let's put some white in here. So we're looking at warmer, more saturate, whereas in the shadow we're looking at cooler, less saturate. pull a bit of vermilion in here. I've got two brands of vermilion. This one is more of a rose one, this one is more of a hot orange looking vermilion. Artists like vermilion particularly because it doesn't go too cold when you add white to it. A lot of reds will turn a pink that's almost purple when you get white in them. Now notice again that I'm not just going for one or two tones, I'm going for a range. I'm going to pull a bit of blue in over here because some of our higher colours will be a bit on the violet side. So some cobalt over here, and a little bit of that more rose coloured vermilion. Let's get some white in there. Just so that we've got a little range of violets. Violet and yellow will make a grey because they are complementaries. That comes down in saturation, so you've got to be careful not to make too much mud in the higher end of the tones. I'm just going to stump that brush out a little bit. Alright then. Let's look at how these translate. That's very, very hot, that one. Pull a little bit of the violet in here. You'll see how alternating yellow and violet gives you a more intense bright light effect than just simple violet itself. My apologies, Sir Winston, I am painting upside down, demonstrating flesh tones only. Right. So you can see that really, when we get up really close to the highlights, that little bit of cooler colour intimates some daylight coming into the picture, whereas our transitions in between, if I put a little bit of ochre in there now, I can have some warmth to the transitions between some of the highest highlights, but without being too pink. So sometimes we wreck a brush. We leave the paint on it too long, it gets all stuck to it, or the paint gets in the root and it dries and it goes. That's not a brush to chuck away. Now that's a brush for making textures of hair and fur with. So that's what I'm going to do now. So we're going to work with a couple of tones for the hair, and we're going to use a reasonable amount of medium. Now, as with the flesh, we're going to have a darker, lighter, warmer, cool, and compared with flesh, the colour of the hair is relatively cool. So I'm going to drag some cobalt into the flesh tone. It makes a muddy grey. This is my first layer. Now he's not got a lot of hair, not a lot. What he has is greying. Let's go a little warmer than that. Now, one of the important things about painting hair, whether it's hair where it's a little bit seldom, as my grandmother used to call it, when the hair follicles were a bit less frequent, whether it's a little seldom or whether it's a thick head of hair, is that the place where it joins the face is not a line. It's almost indistinguishable from the flesh. So that's why we're coming from warm to the cooler colour just here. But it will also have a soft edge with the background. No hard edges is the rule with hair. influenced by the colour of the background around it. A little bit just coming down below the ear here. Shadow there. Back to a more blue. Up the blue softly. Now I'm describing form in terms of locks of hair. If your brush is already dead, you can do that to it. Now, a bit more cobalt. Want the brush to do this coming out sideways. I'm going to tickle it. More cobalt. Do you see how blue, how much blue and violet there is in this hair? I'm going to alternate it slightly with a little bit of flesh tone. So it's handy having these colours all already mixed. So think about the direction of the light. It's coming from up here. Right, I'm going to go warmer now. There's nothing in hair that's too saturate really. So I've got a little bit of yellow in this colour, a little bit of sort of fleshy yellow from that Naples yellow, which handily won't make a green when we put it in the blue, if you remember. Lock there is quite useful. Let's just bring a little bit more flesh tone up here as it joins the scalp up here. More yellow again. I'm just going down slightly in tone. What I want to do is introduce a couple of, let's put a bit of ochre in it, just as the hair turns away slightly from us. Darker again, a little bit more ochre, just so it's picking up the colour of the context more as it turns away from us. So there's no hard line to the edge of that context. Now, sometimes what you want is not a brush full of paint, but a brush with paint just on the ends. So I'm scooping it. And this will give me a splayed out fibre end. Scoop, scoop. Almost there. It gives the impression that it's painted with the tiny little brush that I had before. But it's not. It's just that the little spiked out fibres of this one are equal to that. So it's much more efficient to work with this bigger brush than it is with the little tiny one. Today we're ready for a glazing layer. I'm going to take the background down in tone. I'm also going to get it to be a little bit more neutral. It's really quite hot in temperature at the moment. So you're going to see the difference that what's effectively a tinted varnish now will make. We've got a glazing medium, and it's made with damar resin, old rectified turpentine, a little bit of oil, a little bit of stand oil, and it goes on like this. So we're tinting the background, we're tinting the foreground to unify it just a little bit as well. My mixture is terre verte, just an earth green, and a little bit of castle, which is often referred to as a Van Dyke brown, a very dark earth brown. I almost want to reach the point where the edge of this shoulder and the edge of that shoulder lost into the background. That will do. That is one glaze set in.
What little we know about Father Hutton, from his knowledge of the classics to his occasional severity of manner, from the texture of his worsted wool coat to his long service to Ratcliffe College and the Catholic community around it, these ideas are all woven visually, layer by layer, into his portrait by means of perspective, tonal weight, pallor, demeanour and expression. I hope the portrait takes its place among the other college presidents for many years to come.